Alright, so picture this. Quiet suburban street. The kind where nothing ever really happens except maybe someone complaining about trash cans being left out too long. Yeah, one of those neighborhoods. Except this time, something did happen, and it flipped the entire power structure upside down. It started with a man everyone had already decided was a joke. His name wasn't important to them. They just called him that old guy with the truck. But let's call him Walter Briggs. 64, retired mechanic. Lived in that neighborhood longer than most of the houses had even been painted their current color. And if you asked the HOA board about him, they'd roll their eyes before they even said his name, because to them, Walter wasn't just a resident, he was a problem. See, in neighborhoods like this, manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, people smiling just enough to look polite, but not enough to mean it. Power doesn't come from money, it comes from control. And control, in this case, belonged to a woman named Denise Harland, president of the HOA, self-appointed guardian of community standards, and the kind of person who could weaponize a clipboard like it was a loaded gun. Denise didn't yell. She didn't need to. She had that calm, cutting tone, the kind that made everything sound like a final warning even when it wasn't. And for 2 straight years, she had been on Walter like clockwork, citations for his faded shutters, warnings about the oil stain in his driveway, fines for a sidewalk crack that, by the way, sat completely inside his own property line. Didn't matter. If it didn't fit her version of perfect, it had to go. And Walter? He didn't fight back. Not publicly anyway. He'd nod, maybe mutter something under his breath, pay some fines, ignore others, but he never showed up to meetings, never argued, never raised his voice. And in a place like that, silence doesn't get interpreted as patience, it gets interpreted as weakness. So yeah, they got comfortable. Too comfortable. Now fast forward to a Saturday morning. Just after 7 a.m., sun barely up, and Walter's already outside digging post holes along the eastern edge of his yard. Slow, steady, methodical, not rushing, not looking around, just doing the work like he'd done 1,000 times before. And that's when Denise shows up. White SUV, spotless, of course, pulls up right along the curb, engine still running. She doesn't even step out, just rolls the window down like she's about to order coffee instead of start a confrontation. You know that fence isn't going where you think it is, she says, loud enough for anyone walking by to hear. And yeah, people were already slowing down, dog walkers, joggers, the usual morning crowd. Everyone loves a little live drama before breakfast. Walter doesn't even look at her at first, just sets another post, pours in the gravel, tamps it down like she's background noise. And that irritates her more than anything. We've already had it measured, she continues, voice sharper now. You're off the property line, and when we prove it, you're paying to remove every single one of these posts. Now at this point, most people would stop, argue, defend themselves something. But Walter? He just pauses for a second, wipes his hands on his jeans, glances up, not angry, not nervous, just calm. Then goes right back to work. No response. And that silence? It lands weird. Because it's not the kind of silence that says, I don't know what I'm doing. It's the kind that says, I know exactly what I'm doing, and I'm not explaining it to you. But Denise doesn't pick up on that. Or maybe she does, and just chooses to ignore it. Either way, she drives off with that tight little smile, the kind people use when they think they've already won. Now here's where it gets interesting. Because what nobody in that neighborhood bothered to ask, not Denise, not the board, not the neighbors watching from their driveways, was why Walter suddenly decided to build a fence, right there, right now. To them, it was just another violation waiting to happen. Another chance to enforce rules, issue fines, remind everyone who was in charge. But what they didn't see, what they couldn't see, was that this wasn't random. This wasn't stubbornness. This was timing. Precise, calculated timing. And 3 days later, Denise comes back, this time with backup. 2 board members, both eager in that we finally get to be part of something important kind of way, and a contractor with measuring equipment ready to document everything. They don't even try to hide it. This is meant to be a show. A public correction. A message. Denise stands at the curb again, arms crossed now, posture rigid, completely in control, or at least she thinks she is. We've already filed a report with the county, she announces, not just to Walter, but to anyone within earshot. Those posts need to be removed by Thursday, or we'll have them taken out ourselves, and you'll be billed for it. There's a pause, just enough time for the weight of that threat to settle. And finally, Walter responds. He straightens up slowly, rests one hand on the post beside him, and looks directly at her. Not angry, not defensive, just certain. If I were you, he says, voice even, almost conversational, I'd hold off on that contractor. And then, just like that, he turns back and keeps working. No explanation, no argument, just that one sentence, hanging there. And I swear, you could feel something shift in that moment. Not for Denise, she brushes it off, of course, but for everyone else watching. Because suddenly, this didn't feel like a one-sided fight anymore. It felt like something else entirely, like maybe, just maybe, they had all misunderstood the situation from the very beginning. All right, let me pause the story for a second, because this right here, this moment where Walter barely says anything, where Denise thinks she's still in control, this is where a lot of people completely misread what's actually going on. And honestly, this kind of situation plays out more often than you'd think in HOA communities. According to standard procedure, HOAs operate on enforcement, not ownership. That's a huge distinction people miss. They can fine you, they can send violation notices, they can even escalate issues to local authorities, but they don't actually own your land. They regulate behavior based on agreed covenants, and those covenants only hold power as long as they stay within legal boundaries. Now here's where it gets interesting. From a legal perspective, property lines are everything. I'm talking survey records, easements, deed restrictions, the stuff most people ignore because it's buried in paperwork from decades ago. But those documents, they can override HOA authority in very specific situations. And if there's even a hint of a boundary dispute, especially one filed officially with the county, that can freeze or complicate enforcement actions real fast. And Denise? She walked straight into that without realizing it. But this isn't just legal, it's psychological too. This is a psychological trap, and it's a classic one. When someone appears passive for long enough, people in power start lowering their guard. They stop questioning, they stop verifying, they assume compliance before it's actually secured. Denise didn't just think she was right, she thought she couldn't be challenged. And that's the dangerous part. Because once you believe that, you stop looking for the variables that could prove you wrong. And Walter? He understood that dynamic perfectly. He didn't argue because arguing would have triggered resistance. He didn't explain because explaining would have exposed his position too early. He let them build momentum, let them commit, let them escalate, because the higher they climbed on that assumption of control, the harder the fall was going to be. And trust me, that fall was already in motion. So by the time Wednesday morning rolls around, everyone's expecting a show. Not officially, of course. Nobody sends out an invite that says, come watch your neighbor get shut down by the HOA. But word spreads, it always does. A couple of residents linger a little longer on their morning walks. Someone parks just a bit closer to the curb than usual. Blinds are tilted open at just the right angle. Yeah, people were waiting. Because in their minds, this was already decided. Walter had pushed too far, Denise had escalated, and now the system was going to come down on him. Clean, efficient, predictable. That's how these things usually go. Except, that's not what happened. Around 9:15 a.m., a county truck pulls into the neighborhood. Not flashy, not dramatic, just a standard utility vehicle, white, with that official seal on the door that makes people instinctively pay attention. Then another one follows. And that's when the energy shifts. Because now it's real. Now it's not just HOA warnings and neighborhood gossip, it's government presence. Denise shows up within minutes, like she's been waiting for this exact moment. Sunglasses on, phone in hand, posture locked in. She doesn't rush, she arrives. And you can tell, she thinks this is validation. This is the part where everything she's been saying gets confirmed. She walks up toward the trucks, already mid-sentence, already in control of the narrative. I'm glad you're here, she says, voice smooth but edged with satisfaction. We've got an ongoing violation that needs to be addressed. But she doesn't even finish the sentence. Because the county workers? They're not looking at Walter's fence. They're not unloading tools to remove posts. They're walking the other direction, toward the entrance road. And at first, it doesn't register. Denise pauses, just slightly, like her brain needs a second to catch up with what her eyes are seeing. One of the workers pulls out a stack of bright orange notices, the kind you don't ignore, and starts posting them along the roadside. Another places a temporary sign near the entrance. And now people are stepping out of their houses. Not casually anymore. This is curiosity turning into concern. Denise walks over, faster now, heels hitting pavement with that sharp, controlled rhythm that's starting to lose its confidence. "Excuse me," she calls out, tone tightening. "What exactly are you doing?" And the guy, mid-40s, calm, clearly not interested in neighborhood politics, barely looks up as he secures the notice. "Posting a road closure warning, ma'am." Just like that. Simple. Matter of fact. No build-up. No drama. But the words? They hit like a shockwave. Road closure? Denise repeats it, like saying it out loud might make it make sense. That's not possible. This is a residential access road. The worker finally turns toward her, not confrontational, just neutral. "It is," he says, "but it's also on a conditional easement." And there it is. That word. Easement. The one nobody bothered to look into. The one buried in documents from decades ago. The one Walter knew exactly how to use. The worker continues, still calm, still procedural. "We received a formal boundary dispute filing 3 weeks ago. That triggers a review of the easement agreement tied to this road. Until the dispute is resolved, access rights are considered unstable." Now Denise isn't speaking anymore. She's reading. She grabs one of the notices, eyes scanning fast, then slower. Then again, like maybe the words will rearrange themselves into something less damaging. But they don't. 60 days. That's what it says. 60 days to renegotiate the easement or lose access entirely. Which means every single resident in that neighborhood, every perfectly trimmed lawn, every HOA-compliant mailbox, every rule-following homeowner would be forced to take a 2-mile detour just to reach their own driveway. And suddenly, this isn't about a fence anymore. This is infrastructure. This is property rights. This is leverage. Real leverage. And Denise? She feels it slipping. Not all at once. Not dramatically, but in that slow, unmistakable way where control doesn't shatter, it dissolves. Because there's nothing she can enforce here. No fine she can issue. No rule she can quote. This is outside her system. Completely. And then, almost like the universe has a sense of timing, Walter walks by. Just walks by. No rush. No announcement. No "I told you so." He's heading back from his yard, gloves in one hand, dust still on his jeans, like this is just another part of his morning routine. He passes Denise, who's still holding that notice, still processing, still trying to find a foothold in a situation that no longer belongs to her. And he nods. That's it. Just a small, almost polite nod. And if you weren't paying attention, you'd miss it. But in that moment, it says everything. Because this was never about proving her wrong. It was about letting her prove herself wrong. Publicly, completely, and on a scale she didn't see coming. Now here's the part that really lands. The retaining wall the HOA built back in 2019, the one Denise approved without a second thought, it crossed into Walter's property by just enough to matter. Not enough for anyone to notice casually, but enough to trigger a legal dispute if someone decided to look closely. And Walter did. He didn't react when they fined him. He didn't argue when they pushed him. He waited. He reviewed. He filed. Quietly. Precisely. 3 weeks before he ever picked up that shovel. So when Denise threatened enforcement, she was already standing on unstable ground. She just didn't know it yet. And that fence, that wasn't the start of the conflict. That was the signal. The visible move that made everyone look in the wrong direction, while the real move had already been made. And now the entire neighborhood was dealing with the consequences of a mistake that started with arrogance and ended with a legal reality nobody could ignore. So yeah, that's how it ended. No shouting match, no dramatic courtroom scene, no last-minute apology speech, just a quiet man, a stack of legal documents, and an entire neighborhood suddenly realizing they'd been playing checkers while someone else was playing chess the whole time. And if you've ever lived in an HOA community, or honestly, even just dealt with any kind of authority structure, you probably felt something click during that story. Because this wasn't really about a fence. It wasn't even about the road. It was about perception, control, and the dangerous assumption that silence equals surrender. The lesson here is, the loudest person in the room isn't always the one in charge. Sometimes it's the one who's already done the homework, already read the fine print, already made the move before anyone else even realized there was a game being played. And look, I'm not saying every HOA is out here abusing power. Some of them are actually well-run, fair, necessary even. But the system itself? It creates a very specific dynamic. Small groups of people get used to being the final authority on what's acceptable, and over time, that authority can start to feel absolute. That's where things go sideways. Because once you stop questioning your own limits, you start assuming other people don't have any leverage. And that's exactly what happened here. Denise didn't just enforce rules. She believed those rules were the highest level of power available. She forgot that there are layers above HOA authority, legal layers, county layers, property law that doesn't care about neighborhood aesthetics or board votes. From a legal perspective, Walter didn't win because he was aggressive. He won because he was precise. He identified a vulnerability, the easement tied to a condition, and he used the proper channel to activate it. No shortcuts, no emotional reactions, just process. And that's the part a lot of people miss. You don't beat a system like that by arguing louder. You beat it by understanding it better. Now let's talk about the psychological side for a second, because this is where it gets even more interesting. This is a psychological trap, and it's one people fall into all the time. When someone doesn't push back, when they don't defend themselves in obvious ways, we tend to downgrade them in our minds. We assume they're passive, uninformed, maybe even incapable. And once that assumption sets in, we stop being careful. We stop double-checking. We stop asking, what am I missing? Denise didn't lose control in that moment when the county truck showed up. She lost it weeks earlier, when she decided Walter wasn't a threat worth analyzing. That's the real turning point. And if you think about it, that applies way beyond HOAs. Workplaces, relationships, negotiations, anywhere there's a power imbalance, the same pattern shows up. The person who looks like they have less power often gets underestimated, and sometimes, that's exactly where their advantage comes from. Because while everyone else is focused on appearances, they're focused on structure, on timing, on leverage. And when the shift happens, it feels sudden, but it never is. It's just the moment where preparation becomes visible. According to standard procedure, once a formal dispute is filed on something like an easement, everything tied to that agreement gets reevaluated. Access, usage rights, obligations, all of it. That's not a loophole. That's the system working exactly as designed. The difference is, most people never think to use it. Walter did. And he didn't just use it to defend himself. He used it to reset the entire balance of power in that neighborhood, without raising his voice once. So what do you take from all this? Honestly, a couple things. First, don't confuse quiet with weak. Some people aren't reacting because they're overwhelmed. They're not reacting because they're already 10 steps ahead. Second, if you're in any kind of structured system, whether it's an HOA, a workplace, or anything with rules and enforcement, learn how that system actually works. Not just the surface level stuff, the deeper mechanics. Because that's where the real leverage lies. And third, if you're the one in a position of authority, stay curious, stay cautious. The moment you start believing you can't be challenged, that's usually when you've already missed something important. Now I'm curious what you think. Was Walter justified in what he did, or did he take it too far by putting the entire neighborhood at risk just to make a point? And what about Denise? Was she just doing her job, or did she cross a line somewhere along the way? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because stories like this always hit differently depending on which side you see yourself on.